Wet palettes. Wet palettes. Wet palettes. Loved by so many, misunderstood by so many more, and kind of just not heard of by a whole bunch of people too. They're a tool that, for me, I consider to be quite essential to my painting process, and I don't really think I could do most of what I do without one. But for a lot of people, the barrier really to getting into them is just not understanding what they do. So instead of talking about the technical side, the setup, what materials are good, what materials are bad, who makes a good wet palette, who makes a bad wet palette, those things have been covered a million times on YouTube, and I don't want to waste your time. So what I'd like to talk about instead is just what they actually do. Okay, so the first thing, and I guess the smartest thing to talk about first is, as you can see here, they really just keep paint wet for a very long time. Some of the paint on this palette at the time of filming this scene was days old, and because the wet palette has a damp atmosphere inside, it stops the top layer from skinning over, and there's moisture coming up from underneath through the membrane, and the combination of those two things means that your paint just doesn't dry out very quickly, which is really handy. But the thing is, that's kind of obvious. I think most people watching this video will already know that. So what does a wet palette really do? Okay, let's say starting out we want to do some fairly complex blending or even just layering, and we want to work between three distinct colours that are very different to each other. Well, first of all, not only can we now mix all those in-between tones in advance and keep them on the wet palette, safe in the knowledge that they'll be accessible and usable and workable for the whole time that we're painting this project, but if you want an in-between of an in-between shade, say if you are layering for example, then the in-between shades are already there. You don't have to remix them and then tune from there. You just grab the two in-between shades and ram them together and get another colour. What's more, even better than that, by the time I've finished this entire workup, all of the armour on this palatine, everything's still wet on the palette, and I can come back to it if I wish to. If I need to make any corrections, any adjustments, any little things like that, the colours are there, they're wet on the palette, and they're ready for me to use still. Even better than that, you get the ability to plan a gradient in advance. This is a really powerful tool in miniature painting, especially when you start to get into more advanced blendy stuff like skin tones, for example. You can map the whole thing out before you've ever even touched the miniature, creating either a mashed together sort of area that has a gradient of all the different colours in it, or creating distinct different puddles of colour in the gradient. And the ones that you don't want to use, you just skip them, but at least you know the ones that do hit the right notes for you, they're there, and they're going to be there for the whole time you're painting. And, like, not to beat a dead horse, but this is me going back to the palette after an hour during the filming of this video, and the paint is still wet. That doesn't happen on a dry palette. Another thing I absolutely love is being able to grab one base colour and take it in two different directions for the sake of experimentation. And again, they're just there and available for me, so then if I want to start mixing in between them, it's easy for me to do that. That kind of thing. That's really helpful to me. Metallics on a wet palette? Now, a lot of people have been spreading some naughty misinformation about metallics on a wet palette, saying that they soak through into the bottom layer and ruin your wet palette and that you'll get sparkly bits in the rest of your paints. None of it is true. It's been debunked many times. But the really beautiful thing about metallics on a wet palette is you don't have to race them. You know how with metallics, when they first come out of the pot or the bottle, they're so beautifully silky and they apply really evenly and really nicely. And then even when they're not fully dried, they start to gum up really quickly. They start to go tacky. And you're really racing against that. You really find that you're trying to apply metallics as quickly as possible so that you get that fresh out of the bottle smoothness. Not a problem with a wet palette. You get probably 20-30 minutes before even any thoughts of gumminess come to mind. And again, skin tones. Skin tones become so much easier when you can keep live gradients on the wet palette. Being able to go backwards and forwards between all those sort of little different parts of the gradient and cherry pick the parts that are right for you to get all those really subtle variations that we're used to seeing in skin tones. That's mega. And without a wet palette, I honestly don't even think I'd have been able to do this palatine in the way that I did it. Let alone in the 5 hours it took me. This was not a lengthy paint. This was like just over half a day. And the wet palette is really what made a lot of that process so much easier. So for those of you who maybe didn't understand before watching this video what a wet palette actually does and why they are so sung about in the mini painting community, you know, why they're such a thing that everyone praises and lauds as another one of those hobby saviors, it's really just because they make your life so much easier that you can get so much more done in the time. You're not having to constantly replace or refresh paints on your palette. You're not having to worry about, oh, that gradient that I mixed earlier, can I get that colour matched again? Well, you don't need to because it's still there, it's still wet. That kind of stuff makes a huge difference to your painting processes, to how relaxed you are when you paint, to how straightforward working through something is, because you know that you can just rely on that palette to keep that paint workable for you, and you'll be able to go back to it whenever you're ready. So I hope you liked this video. I hope you found it informative or interesting or maybe even funny, maybe. Wet palettes. Wet palettes. Wet palettes. Probably not. But either way, if you want to come back for more, you can like this video, you can subscribe to the channel, and you can enable notifications. Of course, do get at me in the comments if you think that I missed anything when talking about wet palettes, if you think there's any really important pluses that I should have mentioned, or if you think that there's indeed any negatives that I didn't mention and it was perhaps remiss of me to do so. And of course, don't forget, if you love the content and you want to support its creation, there is also a Patreon campaign, and all my social media links, they are down in the description below. You can check those out at your leisure and pleasure. It's time for me to roll the end credits now, folks, so I'm going to get out of here and say goodbye, but I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching, everyone, and bye for now.